The idea is unsettling. A church built on vows of poverty, humility, and moral authority. A bank hidden behind ancient walls, wrapped in secrecy. And beneath the marble halls and golden altars, money moving in the shadows. Not charity money, not donations for the poor, but billions of dollars flowing through offshore accounts, shell companies, and criminal networks. For decades, rumors whispered that the Vatican's financial system was compromised, that it wasn't merely mismanaged, that it wasn't simply incompetent, but that it had become something far darker, a financial crossroads where mobsters, dictators, arms dealers, intelligence agencies, and corrupt clergy quietly did business. At the center of it all stood an institution few people even understood, the Vatican Bank. Officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion, its mission sounded noble: to manage funds for religious orders, dioceses, and charitable organizations. But its structure was unusual. It did not operate like a normal bank. It wasn't subject to Italian banking law. It didn't publish transparent balance sheets. It answered only to the Pope. That insulation created a perfect environment for secrecy, and secrecy in finance is oxygen for crime. By the mid-20th century, as organized crime expanded across Europe and the Americas, criminals began searching for ways to move money across borders without detection. Swiss banks were already famous for discretion. But even Swiss secrecy had limits. The Vatican offered something better: a sovereign entity, diplomatic immunity, and accounts that could be opened in the name of religious institutions rather than individuals. For anyone looking to clean dirty money, it looked like a miracle. But how did a spiritual institution become entangled with gangsters? The answer begins in post-World War II Europe. Italy was devastated. Cities lay in ruins. The economy was shattered. Black markets flourished. At the same time, the mafia had emerged stronger than ever. During the war, Allied forces had quietly cooperated with Sicilian mob bosses to undermine Mussolini's fascist regime. In exchange, many mafia figures gained influence, political connections, and protection. When the war ended, these criminal networks were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were rebuilding Italy, and they needed banks. Not ordinary banks. They needed places that wouldn't ask questions, that wouldn't report suspicious activity, that wouldn't cooperate with police. Meanwhile, inside the Vatican, a different crisis was unfolding. The Church had lost enormous wealth during the war. Properties were destroyed. Investments collapsed. Entire dioceses were financially crippled. The Vatican needed to rebuild its financial base quickly. That pressure created vulnerability. Into this environment stepped a series of powerful, ambitious churchmen who believed that the Church must be financially strong at any cost. They argued that money itself was neutral. It could be used for good or evil. If questionable alliances produced funds that strengthened the Church, they believed the ends justified the means. That philosophical shortcut would prove catastrophic. By the 1950s and 60s, whispers about strange transactions began to circulate. Large sums appeared in Vatican-linked accounts with no clear origin. Money moved in and out of offshore companies tied to known criminals. Middlemen appeared who seemed to operate both in religious and criminal circles. One of the earliest warning signs came from Italian financial investigators. They noticed that certain mob-connected businessmen were using religious foundations as fronts. On paper, these foundations claimed to fund schools, hospitals, and missions. In reality, they existed almost entirely to move money. Cash from drug trafficking or illegal gambling would be donated to a foundation. The foundation deposited the money into Vatican-linked accounts. The Vatican's reputation gave the funds an aura of legitimacy. Later, the money emerged as clean loans, investments, or charitable grants. Dirty cash went in. Holy money came out, but investigations repeatedly stalled. Whenever prosecutors attempted to push deeper, they encountered a wall of sovereignty. The Vatican is its own state. Italian police could not simply raid its offices. Subpoenas stopped at the border. Even arrest warrants meant little inside Vatican City. This legal firewall transformed the Vatican Bank into one of the most attractive financial shelters on earth, and criminals noticed. So did intelligence agencies. During the Cold War, Western governments were obsessed with stopping communism. The Catholic Church positioned itself as one of the strongest ideological opponents of Marxism. In Eastern Europe, communist regimes persecuted priests, seized churches, and restricted religious activity. For Western strategists, supporting the church became a geopolitical tool. That support often came in the form of covert funding. Money moved secretly to support anti-communist networks. Some of that money passed through the Vatican. The lines between politics, espionage, faith, and crime began to blur. The Vatican Bank was no longer just a bank. It was a financial crossroads, and at crossroads predators gather. Inside the church, few truly understood what was happening. Many priests and bishops assumed the bank was run ethically. Others sensed something was wrong but were afraid to speak. Those who did raise concerns were often marginalized, transferred, silenced, or ignored. The Vatican's culture emphasized obedience. Questioning financial leadership could be framed as questioning the church itself. And questioning the church, for a devout Catholic, was unthinkable. This culture of silence allowed corruption to grow unchecked. By the late 1960s, a new generation of financiers entered the picture. Men who dressed like bankers, spoke like aristocrats, and moved effortlessly between boardrooms and back alleys. They specialized in complex corporate structures, shell companies, offshore trusts, layered transactions designed to conceal ownership. These men would become the architects of the Vatican Bank's darkest era. But at this stage, most of the world still had no idea. To ordinary Catholics, the Vatican remained a symbol of moral certainty. To believers, it was the last bastion of spiritual authority in a chaotic world. To criminals, it was something else entirely, a sacred vault, not because it was holy, but because it was untouchable. And soon, the people who exploited that vault would grow so powerful that even popes would struggle to control them. By the early 1970s, the Vatican Bank had quietly transformed into something unrecognizable from its original mission. It was no longer simply holding funds for dioceses and religious orders. It had become an international financial hub. Money flowed in from Latin America, the Middle East, Europe, and the United States. Some of it came from legitimate church sources. Much of it did not. At the center of this transformation stood a quiet but immensely powerful American cleric, Paul Marcinkus. Tall, blunt, and fiercely loyal to the papacy, Marcinkus had been appointed head of the Vatican Bank in 1971. He had no formal training in international finance. What he did have was absolute trust from the highest levels of the Vatican. Marcinkus believed deeply that the Church needed wealth to survive in a modern world. He saw financial power as spiritual armor. Under his leadership, the bank expanded aggressively. It opened relationships with major European banks. It invested in commercial ventures. It created complex financial structures that few inside the Vatican understood. But Marcinkus did not build this empire alone. He found partners. Some wore suits, some wore collars, others wore neither. One of his most important allies was an Italian financier with impeccable manners and a sinister reputation, Michele Sindona. Sindona presented himself as a devout Catholic. He donated heavily to church causes. He cultivated relationships with bishops, cardinals, and politicians. Behind closed doors, however, Sindona was deeply embedded in organized crime. Italian prosecutors later described him as a financial bridge between the mafia and legitimate banking. Sindona specialized in moving money through layers of shell companies. He bought struggling banks, stripped their assets, then used creative accounting to hide the damage. The Vatican Bank became one of his most important partners. Together, Sindona and Marcinkus developed a system. Mafia-linked cash would be funneled into Sindona-controlled banks. From there, it would be transferred into Vatican bank accounts. Once inside Vatican territory, the money effectively disappeared from the reach of Italian regulators. Later, the funds would re-emerge as clean investments, real estate, corporate shares, loans, entire companies. On paper, everything looked legal. In reality, it was one of the largest money laundering operations in Europe. By the mid-1970s, Sindona controlled a sprawling financial empire. But empires built on fraud eventually collapse. When several of his banks began failing, investigators uncovered massive holes in their balance sheets. Billions were missing. Italian authorities issued arrest warrants. Sindona fled to the United States. There he was arrested, convicted of fraud, and later extradited back to Italy. But before his downfall, Sindona had introduced Marcinkus to another man. A man who would push Vatican financial corruption to an even higher level. Roberto Calvi. Calvi was the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, one of Italy's largest private banks. He cultivated the image of a conservative Catholic businessman. He attended Mass regularly. He spoke openly about his faith. Privately, he was building a labyrinth of offshore companies across Panama, Luxembourg, and the Bahamas. These shell corporations existed for one purpose: to move money invisibly. Calvi's relationship with the Vatican Bank was formalized through a series of letters known as patronage agreements. These letters stated that the Vatican Bank stood behind certain Ambrosiano subsidiaries. In practical terms, this meant the Vatican was quietly guaranteeing their debts. That guarantee gave Calvi extraordinary credibility. Investors trusted him because they believed the Vatican would never allow failure. Calvi used that trust ruthlessly. He borrowed vast sums. He shifted money between shell companies. He disguised losses as loans. And once again, mafia-linked funds flowed through the system. Italian investigators later discovered that huge amounts of Ambrosiano money had been diverted to criminal organizations, political slush funds, and secret operations. Some funds supported anti-communist groups in Eastern Europe. Others vanished into organized crime networks. The Vatican Bank was woven through it all, not as a passive bystander, but as a structural pillar. Inside the Vatican, alarms were going off. Lower-level officials raised concerns. Auditors asked uncomfortable questions, but Marcinkus remained protected. He had powerful friends. And as long as money kept flowing, few wanted to disrupt the machine. The situation grew even darker with the involvement of a shadowy organization few Catholics had ever heard of. Propaganda Due, better known as P2. P2 was a secret Masonic lodge operating illegally in Italy. Its membership list, discovered in 1981, read like a who's who of Italian power: politicians, military officers, intelligence chiefs, media executives, and yes, bankers. Both Sindona and Calvi were members. P2's goal was simple: control key institutions, manipulate public opinion, and prevent the rise of left-wing governments. Money was the fuel, black money. Untraceable money. The kind that moved easily through Vatican-linked channels. Through P2, financial crime merged with political conspiracy. This was no longer just about greedy bankers. It was about shaping the future of a nation, and possibly of Europe. As Ambrosiano's finances deteriorated, Calvi grew desperate. He begged Marcinkus for help. He demanded that the Vatican honor its guarantees, but the scale of the losses was too large. In 1982, Banco Ambrosiano collapsed. It left a hole of more than $1 billion. Italian authorities went public. They accused Calvi of massive fraud. They pointed directly at the Vatican Bank as a central player. The scandal exploded across international headlines. For the first time, ordinary Catholics around the world saw stories linking the Vatican to mafia money and financial crimes. The Church's image of moral purity cracked. But the worst was yet to come, because Roberto Calvi was about to disappear, and when his body was found, it would raise questions that still haunt the Vatican today. 4. On the morning of June 18, 1982, a passerby walking along the River Thames in London noticed something strange beneath Blackfriars Bridge. A body hung from the scaffolding. The man was dressed in an expensive suit. His pockets were stuffed with bricks. Inside his jacket were wads of cash in different currencies: Italian lira, British pounds, US dollars. The corpse was identified as Roberto Calvi. Just days earlier, Calvi had vanished from Italy as authorities closed in on him for fraud, false accounting, and illegal currency exports. The chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, the Vatican's most important financial partner, the man who knew where the money went. Officially, British authorities initially ruled his death a suicide. A disgraced banker facing prison takes his own life. Case closed. But almost immediately, the story began to unravel. Forensic experts pointed out inconsistencies. Calvi's hands showed no signs of having handled bricks. He suffered injuries inconsistent with hanging. Witnesses reported seeing suspicious men near the bridge the night he died. Italian investigators rejected the suicide conclusion. They believed Calvi had been murdered, silenced. The symbolism of the location was chilling. Blackfriars. Blackfriars, a phrase that echoed the black-robed friars of secret societies. And to many investigators, that symbolism was not accidental. Calvi had been a member of the secret Masonic Lodge Propaganda do P2, a clandestine network that included politicians, generals, intelligence chiefs, and financiers, a network built on secrecy and mutual protection. Calvi had lost billions. He had betrayed powerful people, and now he was dead. The question was simple: who ordered the killing? Italian prosecutors began pulling threads. They discovered that Banco Ambrosiano's collapse was not a single crime. It was a web of crimes: false loans, fake companies, circular transfers, money disappearing into offshore accounts controlled by shell corporations in Panama, the Bahamas, and Luxembourg. And running through many of those transactions was one recurring institution: the Vatican Bank, formerly known as the Institute for the Works of Religion. Investigators estimated that hundreds of millions of dollars had moved between Ambrosiano and Vatican-linked accounts. Some of those funds had ended up in companies controlled by organized crime. Others had been routed into political slush funds. Still, others had vanished completely. Italian prosecutors issued arrest warrants for several Ambrosiano executives. They also sought to question the head of the Vatican Bank, Paul Marcinkus, but Marcinkus lived inside Vatican City. Italian police could not touch him. The Vatican refused extradition. Instead, Marcinkus remained under Vatican protection for years, rarely appearing in public. To critics, this looked like a cover-up. To Vatican officials, it was framed as defense of sovereignty. Either way, it fueled global outrage. For the first time in modern history, a major Western religious institution stood accused of enabling one of the largest financial frauds in Europe. The Vatican's response was cautious. Officials denied criminal intent. They claimed the bank had been deceived by Calvi, that it was merely a victim. But behind closed doors, panic set in. The Vatican Bank faced potential insolvency. If it were forced to honor all the guarantees issued for Ambrosiano subsidiaries, the losses could bankrupt it. Secret negotiations began with Ambrosiano's liquidators. Eventually, the Vatican agreed to pay a substantial sum, hundreds of millions of dollars, as a contribution to victims. Not an admission of guilt, not compensation. A contribution. It was legal language, but to the public it sounded like hush money. Meanwhile, the investigation into Calvi's death intensified. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, new forensic examinations were conducted. They concluded that Calvi had been murdered. Italian courts later ruled that his death was homicide. Prosecutors alleged that Calvi had been killed by mafia operatives, acting in coordination with financial and Masonic interests. Why? Because Calvi had lost mafia money. A lot of it. Organized crime groups had entrusted him with laundering profits from heroin trafficking and illegal gambling. When Ambrosiano collapsed, that money disappeared. In the underworld, losing money is bad. Losing other people's money is fatal. But Calvi may also have been preparing to talk. In the weeks before his death, he had written desperate letters. He warned Vatican officials that everything was about to explode. He claimed he had been used as a pawn. He hinted that powerful figures would fall if the truth came out. If Calvi had testified, the damage could have been catastrophic, not just for Italian bankers, but for the Vatican, for political parties, for intelligence services. Silencing him solved many problems at once. No trial, no testimony, no full accounting. Yet Calvi's death did not end the scandal, it amplified it. Journalists around the world began digging into Vatican finances. Books were published. Whistleblowers emerged. Former insiders described a culture of secrecy, intimidation, and deliberate obfuscation. They described a bank that had no meaningful external oversight, a bank where a small circle of men controlled billions with little accountability. Public trust in the Vatican plummeted. For devout Catholics, the pain was profound. They had donated money believing it would feed the poor, build schools, support missions. Instead, some of it had fueled fraud and organized crime. For skeptics, the scandal confirmed long-held suspicions that behind the church's moral language lay the same greed and corruption found in any powerful institution. And yet, despite the outrage, despite the headlines, despite the body hanging beneath a London bridge, no senior Vatican official went to prison, no pope was charged, no full public accounting of Vatican bank operations was ever released. The system bent, but it did not break, which raised an even more disturbing question. If a scandal this large failed to bring real accountability, what else had been hidden, and what was still happening behind those ancient walls? By the mid-1980s, the Vatican was a wounded institution. The Banco Ambrosiano collapse had shattered its image. Roberto Calvi was dead. The Vatican Bank had paid hundreds of millions of dollars to settle claims. And yet, the deeper structure that enabled corruption remained largely intact. Inside the Holy See, two opposing forces emerged. One side believed the scandal was a tragic anomaly, a few bad actors, a few bad decisions. Fix the surface problems and move on. The other side believed something far more radical, that the Vatican Bank itself, as designed, was incompatible with transparency. That secrecy was not an accident. It was the system. At the center of this internal struggle stood the man who had reigned over the Vatican Bank during its darkest years, Paul Marcinkus. To critics, Marcinkus symbolized everything that had gone wrong. An untrained cleric given control over a global financial operation. A man who trusted the wrong people, or worse, a man who knowingly cooperated with criminals. To his defenders, Marcinkus was a loyal servant of the church. They argued he had acted in good faith, that he had been deceived by sophisticated financiers like Michele Sindona and Roberto Calvi, that blaming him was scapegoating. For years, Marcinkus remained inside Vatican City, effectively untouchable. Italian prosecutors sought to question him. The Vatican refused. Eventually, in the late 1980s, Marcinkus quietly stepped down from the Vatican Bank. No trial, no conviction, no formal admission of wrongdoing. He was reassigned to a parish in the United States. For many observers, it looked less like accountability, and more like exile with honors. The message was clear. The Vatican would not publicly sacrifice one of its own, not if doing so risked exposing the institution itself. Reform efforts did begin, but they were cautious, incremental, often cosmetic. New statutes were written, Internal auditing departments were expanded. Outside consultants were occasionally brought in. But the Vatican Bank remained exempt from many of the transparency requirements imposed on normal banks. No public financial statements. No routine external audits in line with international standards. No independent regulator with real power. Why? Because full transparency threatened to open old wounds. Every audit risked uncovering past crimes. Every disclosure risked implicating living officials. Better, some argued, to leave the past buried. This reluctance created fertile ground for continued abuse. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, new scandals surfaced. Italian authorities discovered Vatican-linked accounts being used by businessmen under investigation for tax evasion. Journalists uncovered cases where corrupt politicians had routed bribe money through religious foundations. Once again, the pattern was familiar. The Vatican Bank was rarely accused of directly committing crimes. Instead, it provided infrastructure, accounts, transfers, letters of comfort, tools that criminals could exploit. Critics called it willful blindness. Supporters called it poor oversight. Either way, the result was the same. Dirty money kept finding its way into holy vaults. Inside the Vatican, fear shaped decision-making. Leaders worried that aggressive reform would destabilize the church financially. The Vatican is not funded by a single government. It relies on donations, investments, and returns from assets. Sudden financial shocks could cripple its operations worldwide. Hospitals, schools, charities, all depended at least indirectly on Vatican finances. This created a moral paradox. To protect good works, leaders tolerated a system that enabled evil, or at least looked away from it. Some insiders tried to push harder. They warned that without real transparency, the church's credibility would continue to erode. They argued that moral authority, once lost, is almost impossible to regain. Several reform-minded officials found themselves sidelined, transferred, their projects quietly canceled, their warnings dismissed as alarmist. Then came a series of mysterious deaths, not all directly tied to the Vatican Bank, not all clearly criminal, but enough to deepen the atmosphere of dread. In 1998, the commander of the Swiss Guard and his wife were found dead inside Vatican City, along with a young guard. The official explanation was murder-suicide. Conspiracy theories exploded. No evidence ever conclusively linked the deaths to financial scandals. But in an environment already saturated with secrecy, suspicion flourished. Rumors circulated about internal documents disappearing, about whistleblowers being pressured, about files locked away in secret archives. True or not, these stories reinforced a perception. The Vatican was a place where dangerous secrets lived. At the same time, global attitudes toward financial crime were shifting. After major banking scandals and the rise of international anti-money laundering standards, pressure mounted on all financial institutions to modernize. Governments demanded greater transparency. Banks that failed to comply risked blacklisting. The Vatican could not remain isolated forever. By the late 2000s, it faced an uncomfortable reality. Either it reformed, or it risked becoming a global financial pariah. This tension set the stage for a new era, an era in which popes would publicly promise transparency, in which commissions would be created, in which dramatic speeches would be made about cleaning house. But promises are easy. Systems are hard to change, especially when those systems have protected powerful people for decades. The Vatican Bank was not just a financial institution. It was a repository of secrets. Secrets about alliances, secrets about political interventions, secrets about compromises made in the name of survival. To truly reform, it would require more than new rules. It would require confronting history, admitting wrongdoing, naming names, and accepting consequences. So far, no pope had been willing to go that far. Which leads to the final act of this story, a modern Vatican, a world demanding transparency. And a question that still hangs in the air: has the Vatican Bank truly changed, or has it simply learned to hide better? When you're ready, I'll deliver examining recent reforms, modern investigations, and whether the Vatican has genuinely escaped its dark financial past. By the early 2010s, the Vatican faced a crisis unlike any it had experienced before. For decades, financial scandals had come and gone, but now the world had changed. Global banking was increasingly regulated. International watchdogs tracked suspicious transactions. Whistleblowers leaked documents instantly, and journalists could collaborate across borders. The old model secrecy, internal handling, quiet settlements no longer worked. The Vatican was being watched closely. This new reality forced the Church into a position it had long avoided, publicly acknowledging that its financial system had serious problems. In 2013, a new pope was elected who presented himself as a reformer, a man who spoke openly about poverty, humility, and cleaning house. Pope Francis made Vatican finances a central priority of his papacy. Almost immediately, he ordered a sweeping review of Vatican economic institutions, including the Vatican Bank. For the first time, outside experts were brought in with real authority: independent auditors, financial crime specialists, compliance officers with experience in modern anti-money laundering systems. Accounts were frozen. Thousands of dormant or suspicious accounts were closed. Entire departments were restructured. New laws were introduced criminalizing money laundering, corruption, and financial fraud within Vatican territory. On paper, it looked revolutionary. For supporters of Pope Francis, these steps represented a historic break from the past. They argued that the Vatican was finally confronting its demons, that the culture of automatic secrecy was being dismantled, that transparency, while imperfect, was genuinely increasing. But critics were not convinced. They pointed out several uncomfortable facts. First, many reforms depended on internal Vatican bodies, not independent international regulators. The Vatican still largely policed itself. Second, few high-ranking officials from earlier scandals ever faced serious legal consequences. There were resignations, quiet dismissals, reassignments, but almost no criminal trials, no public reckoning comparable to what occurred in major corporate scandals. Third, whistleblowers continued to report resistance inside the system. Leaks in 2015 revealed internal power struggles over financial control. Senior figures accused each other of blocking investigations. Reformers were sometimes marginalized. Traditionalists argued that too much transparency threatened the Church's sovereignty. The old tension remained: survival versus accountability. Meanwhile, international watchdog groups began evaluating the Vatican's progress. Their reports acknowledged improvement, but they also noted ongoing deficiencies: inconsistent enforcement, limited prosecutions, incomplete transparency. In other words, better than before, still far from ideal. For ordinary Catholics, this created a painful dilemma. Many wanted to believe the Church had turned a corner. They saw Pope Francis's humility, his emphasis on serving the poor, his condemnation of greed. They hoped the darkest days of Vatican finance were over. Others felt betrayed. They asked why the Church, which demands moral accountability from individuals, seemed so reluctant to hold its own leaders accountable. Why confession, penance, and restitution were preached, but rarely practiced at the institutional level. The Vatican Bank itself continues to exist. It still manages billions of dollars. It still operates under unique legal conditions. It still enjoys a degree of secrecy unknown in most modern banking systems. Supporters argue that this is necessary to protect religious freedom, to shield church operations in hostile countries, to prevent governments from interfering in spiritual matters. Critics counter that secrecy is precisely what allowed decades of abuse, that without full transparency, there can be no real trust. The deeper question is not merely whether specific regulations have improved. It is whether the underlying culture has changed. In the era of Marcinkus, Sindona, and Calvi, the dominant mindset was pragmatic. Money was a tool. Power was protection. If questionable alliances strengthened the church, they were tolerated. Today, Vatican leaders speak a different language. They talk about ethics, about moral consistency, about the danger of corruption. But language alone does not transform institutions. Only consequences do, and consequences remain rare, which leads to the uncomfortable conclusion at the heart of this entire story. The Vatican bank scandal was not just about a few crooked bankers. It was not just about mafia money. It was not even just about financial crime. It was about what happens when a powerful institution begins to believe that it exists above ordinary moral rules. When leaders convince themselves that their mission is so important, that almost anything can be justified in its defense, that mindset is not unique to the Vatican. It appears in governments, corporations, intelligence agencies, anywhere power concentrates and accountability weakens. But when it appears inside a religious institution that claims divine moral authority, the damage is uniquely devastating, because it doesn't just destroy trust in leaders. It destroys faith itself. So has the Vatican truly escaped its dark financial past? The honest answer is uncertain. There are real reforms, real improvements, real attempts to modernize. But there is also a long history of secrecy, a long history of protecting insiders, a long history of choosing institutional survival over moral clarity. Those habits do not disappear overnight. Perhaps the most telling fact is this. Decades after billions disappeared, decades after a banker was found hanging beneath a London bridge, decades after evidence pointed toward systemic corruption, we still do not have a complete public accounting of what happened. We still do not know where all the money went. We still do not know who ultimately approved many of the most dangerous decisions. Until those questions are answered openly, the shadow of the Vatican bank scandal will remain, not as a relic of history, but as a warning that even the most sacred institutions are vulnerable to the oldest human temptation of all: power, money, and the belief that they can be controlled.